I just want to say right off the beginning here that I apologize if my voice sounds a little stuffy. Just recovering from being under the weather, but that is the beauty of virtual events, is that you can still have a recovering moderator and not endanger anyone else's health. So I'm very excited to be doing this and wouldn't miss it for anything. First want to introduce sort of who the folks are that put this event together, and then I'll just talk briefly about who we'll be hearing from and what we'll be doing. And then I'll introduce our first speaker, our VIP speaker for this event. So first of all, I want to say thank you to the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, which for those of you who do not know, is a fantastic organization that is really a source of news, research, and action on poverty-related issues, policy, and findings. We've worked with them on events in the past, and they have been spearheading bringing us all together for this convening here. The organization that I represent, American Policy Ventures, our work and our organization focuses on trying to help members of Congress and Hill staff who are looking to work on a whole range of issues in a bipartisan way, whether that's related to energy, democracy, economic policy, whatever. We look for members who are trying to work in a bipartisan way, and then we try to mobilize to figure out ways we can help them be successful. And so obviously over the next couple of years, I think some of the policy implications of the discussion we're having in this discussion here today will certainly have some possibilities for bipartisan policymaking over the next couple of years. And that's why we felt very fortunate to be a part of this event. Now, in terms of the meat of the discussion, I am really delighted that we're going to be bringing to you some of the really new, hot off the presses research from something called the Baby's First Years Project. For those of you who do not know the Baby's First Years Project, it is the first randomized controlled trial of its kind, providing cash payments in the United States. As the title suggests, it's focused on children, babies in their first years of life. And we're going to hear directly both from, later in the event, we'll hear directly from the researchers who spearheaded this work. And we'll also hear from a couple of subject matter experts who I think will be able to give some of the take on this from a policy point of view. I will just mention briefly that this conversation we're having builds off of another great event that occurred on May 24th, where American Policy Ventures and Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity brought together a bipartisan group of congressional staffers, for everyone from Senator Vance to, and folks from ex-Senator Romney to Senator Cortez Masto, House Democrats, House Republicans, brought a good bipartisan group together to talk about family policy in general over the next couple of years in a bipartisan way. This conversation sort of dives into a particular subset of that broader family and economic poverty reduction policy. And I anticipate we'll have more events upcoming in the future that we'll be excited to tell you all about. With that, again, so our agenda here is we've got our VIP, which I'll introduce in a second, and then we've got our researcher panel discussion, and then we'll have a policy discussion, and then we'll open up for Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, please know there will be an opportunity for that. However, without further ado, I want to introduce our VIP speaker for this event. We're very fortunate that Senator Michael Bennet, Democrat from Colorado, has made some time in his, I'm sure, very busy schedule to share with us this morning. For those of you who do not know, Senator Bennet has represented Colorado in the United States Senate since 2009, among many other things, with probably most relevance to this conversation. He has been a leading supporter and champion on the Democratic side for the expanded child tax credit, or for an expanded child tax credit. As I'm sure many of you know, over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years, there have been champions, particularly in the Senate, for the child tax credit on both sides of the aisle, championing different versions of what they see this policy, what they believe this policy should look like. But there is no doubt that Senator Bennet has been leading among them. For those of you who don't know, he led the effort to ensure that an expanded variety of the child tax credit was included in the American Rescue Plan in early 2021. And as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, he continues his push to make this policy permanent. And so for any sort of bipartisan solution that comes together around this, I think there is no doubt that Senator Bennet will be a leading player in making that happen. So without further ado, I see the senator on the Zoom. I'm going to turn it over to him. Senator, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Liam. And I've learned over the last couple of years to ask always whether you can hear me. So let me first ask whether you can hear. Great.
Clear.
I really appreciate your having me. And I'd also like to thank the Doris Duke Foundation, American Policy Ventures, Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, and everybody involved with the Baby's First Year project. We don't do enough of the kind of research that you've done, and I am extremely grateful. You know, we're here today to talk about child poverty. Speaking for myself, I think our goal for this country should be to end child poverty in the United States. Our country has one of the highest rates of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, in the developed world. And we have one of the lowest rates of economic mobility as well in the developed world. That's a brutal combination for kids who are living in poverty, and it's their everyday reality. When I was the superintendent of Denver Public Schools, I saw every day how growing up in poverty can shape a child's future in ways that are deeply, deeply unfair. Even when people agree child poverty is a problem, many don't think there's anything the federal government can do about it. And I get that skepticism. You know, this is a government that spent 20 years fighting 2 wars in the Middle East that we probably shouldn't have spent 20 years doing. You know, a government that's cut taxes by $8 trillion, the vast majority of those tax cuts benefiting the wealthiest Americans at a time when we've had some of the worst income inequality that we've had since the 1920s. But for 6 brief shining months in 2021, we said to ourselves that we're not going to affect that amount of childhood poverty as a permanent feature of our democracy or a permanent feature of our economy, that there's something we could do to change it. And it's critically important. The US ranks 38th out of 41 developed countries in child poverty. The poorest people in America are our children. And it turns out there is something we can do about it, and we did. We passed the expanded child tax credit. Experts from across the spectrum have looked at the expanded child tax credit, and here's what they've found. And I think this is consistent with the findings you're going to be talking about today. It benefited 61 million kids, or 90% of kids in Colorado and in America. It helped cut childhood poverty nearly in half. It cut hunger by a quarter for families, and it achieved that with not a single additional bureaucrat or government agency. And parents in Colorado over and over again told me that they had spent the money in ways that supported their kids. But the other thing they said, the thing that was so consistent, was that it dramatically reduced the stress in their households. It made it easier for them to work and to stay at work. It made it easier for them to afford childcare and rent so they could stay at work. It was the best thing that we have done, in my view, for kids and families and generations. And people said it would never work. They said the IRS couldn't deploy the monthly payments, that we'd never reach the poorest people. Some said it would cause people to drop out of the American workforce. Experts from the Niskanen Center and the Dallas Federal Reserve all said that the monthly payments did not lead to a reduction in work, and that they had a huge effect in childhood poverty. And now we have this study from Baby's First Years to add to this growing chorus of research that says this is a pro-family, pro-work, and I'd argue a pro-democracy policy. Unfortunately, we didn't extend this policy last year, and now child poverty is rising again. Hunger is rising again. Food banks in Colorado tell me that they're seeing more people in line, even in a growing economy. And I've been here in the middle of the night, you know, when I've seen tax cuts expire for the wealthiest Americans and for the largest corporations, and we've been here till 2 a.m. to make sure that got done. But when it came to children, Washington just went home. And that's because maybe children have no lobbyists. And that's our job. And that's why I'm going to keep fighting until we get this done, and I think we will. Over the last few weeks, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said the child tax credit is an area where we can find bipartisan agreement in a tax package later this year. I could not agree more. I've always said that I believe that at the end of the day, we're going to reach a bipartisan agreement on this. And my priority in that conversation and in that negotiation is to make sure that the 19 million kids who are the poorest kids in our country who've been left out of this credit are able to receive it, are able to benefit from it. The truth is that for generations, we have treated America's children in poverty like they were someone else's kids. I saw that every day that I was superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. It's time to treat them like they're our own kids. And I want you to know that I am going to work with anybody to get this done. And I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank you for caring for our kids and for our democracy. And I hope you enjoy the conversation. If you're in DC, please drop by and say hello. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Senator Bennet, for your remarks. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to share. And I think that Senator Bennet really did an excellent job of setting up this conversation. I think some of the themes and the points that he made will be things that you'll be hearing in the rest of the conversation. So now we will turn to beginning the next part of our program. To do that, I first want to introduce Juyun Chang. Juyun Chang is the program director for child well-being at the Doris Duke Foundation, which is our partner for this event. And so I want to thank her and I want to thank her team for helping this event to be enabled to be put together in the first place. At the Doris Duke Foundation, Juyun oversees grant making to promote, as I said, children's healthy development, to protect them from abuse and neglect. Prior to joining DDF, the Doris Duke Foundation, she served in top leadership roles in the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There, she was a top federal official overseeing the implementation of national child welfare policy. And prior to joining the administration, she oversaw child welfare and juvenile justice systems for the state of Michigan. So very clear, she's been in this field for a long time and is a subject matter expert, and we are very grateful to have her here. I want to turn it over to her to make a few moments of remarks.
Thanks, Liam. Thank you also to Spotlight American Policy Ventures and all the panelists, as well as to all of those who have joined us here today. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Senator Bennet for making time to join us for this event and for his tireless advocacy on behalf of families and children, including his strong leadership for an expanded child tax credit. Again, my name is Juyun Chang, and I'm the director of the Child Wellbeing Program here at the Doris Duke Foundation. Doris Duke is a $2 billion foundation whose mission is to improve the quality of people's lives through grants supporting the performing arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and child well-being. I joined Doris Duke, as Liam said, last year after spending over 20 years working on children's policy and practice at both the state and federal level. The goal at Doris Duke is to promote children's healthy development and protect them from abuse and neglect. What I've learned from my time running child welfare systems and in my conversations with human service directors across the country is that poverty itself causes negative child outcomes, including unnecessary involvement with the child welfare system, especially when it begins in early childhood. For example, when we looked at calls coming into the child abuse and neglect hotline in Michigan, it was clear that most calls were coming to us not because of abuse or neglect, but because families had basic needs that teachers, doctors, and law enforcement didn't know how to address, but couldn't ignore. Research tells us that programs that support families, either directly by providing income transfers or indirectly by providing food, housing, or medical care, have been shown to improve child well-being with effects that can persist through a child's life. Our goal here at Doris Duke is to support families to keep their children safely out of the child welfare system. The Doris Duke Foundation supports research and policy because we recognize that improving outcomes for all children takes a strong partnership between high quality research and policy that responds in real time to what we learn. That's why the baby's first years research that we're going to talk about more today is so groundbreaking. It's the first study, as Liam said, in the United States to assess the impact of poverty reduction on both family life and infant and toddlers' cognitive, emotional, and brain development. And it's yielded some really exciting findings. It's our hope that research like this will lead to the public will and public policies that invest more in our youngest children, which not only benefit them, their families, but our nation. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julian. Now, I want to turn directly to the meat of the conversation, the research on the Baby's First Years project. So if the researchers want to turn their cameras on, I'm going to be introducing you right now. So I want to introduce everyone here listening to the Baby's First Years team. So first, in no particular order, we have Lisa Janetian, who is a professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy and an affiliate of the Center for Child and Family Policy at Duke University. We have Kimberly Noble, who is a professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College at Columbia University. And we have Catherine Magnuson, who's a professor and director of the Institute for Research and Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If there's any of those introductions I got wrong, please feel free to add an addendum to those when you speak. Before I turn it over to the researchers for them they're actually going to share their slide deck and go through their findings for all of you. I just want to remind the audience that if at any point, during the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A at the end again. So be thinking about questions. Feel free to go ahead and post those questions in the Zoom chat, and our team will find those and then bring those, we'll try to curate those for the end, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in, and our team will bring them to the end for Q&A. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the team of researchers and let them share with us their findings.
Great. Thank you so much, Liam. And we do have one of our other principal investigators joining us today as well, Greg Duncan, who's a distinguished professor at the School of Education at UC Irvine. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And many thanks to Spotlight, to the other panelists, and of course to Senator Bennet for making the time. So we've known for a very long time that growing up in poverty puts children at risk for a host of detrimental outcomes, everything from lower school achievement to lower educational attainment, physical and mental health challenges throughout the lifespan, and even differences in brain structure and function. And it turns out that relatively small differences in family income early in childhood tend to predict better outcomes for children. So for example, just a $4,000 difference in annual family income between the prenatal year and age 2 has been shown to predict higher school achievement test scores, increased adult earnings when children grow up, increased time spent in the labor force, and even evidence for improved health in adulthood. But we don't to date have the causal evidence necessary to say whether income in and of itself is causing those differences for children. Or whether conversely, it's all of the characteristics associated with family income that might truly be at the root of these differences. So to be able to disentangle that and to understand whether reducing poverty would in and of itself support children, we need the gold standard of a scientific study, a randomized controlled trial. And so that's the basis for the Baby's First Years study, which is the first randomized controlled trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. Our study design is quite simple. Back in the spring of 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 mothers experiencing low income, recruited from 4 metro areas around the US. And these were mothers who were recruited in the postpartum wards of their hospitals just a day or two after giving birth. Now, upon enrolling in the study, all of the mothers were offered the opportunity to receive a monthly unconditional cash gift that they're free to spend however they would like for the first several years of their children's lives. But critically, the mothers were randomly assigned to one of 2 treatment groups. So the group that we call the high cash gift group is receiving $333 a month, or about $4,000 a year. And the group that we call the low cash gift group is receiving $20 a month, or $240 a year. And those amounts were chosen very intentionally. because that difference of about $4,000 a year has been associated with higher school achievement, among other outcomes, as I showed you on the last slide. And it's also an amount that's similar in size to other social services and benefits that moms experiencing low income are likely to qualify for. So it's both an amount that we felt was likely to move the needle on child development and an amount that would hold some policy relevance. Now, to date, we've put more than $7 million into the pockets of the mothers in our study. And subsequent to enrollment, we've been following up with the families every year around the children's birthdays. And so in this way, by measuring the differential impact in our two groups, we'll be able to assess the causal impact of poverty reduction on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development, physical and mental health, as well as well-being and family life. Now, our sample is racially and ethnically diverse. About 40% self-identify as Black, about 40% self-identify as Latina. The average household income upon enrolling in the study was right around the poverty line at $22,000. And the vast majority of the families in our study are receiving some kind of government benefit. Now, the cash gifts are being dispersed on a debit card branded as the For My Baby card. It was automatically activated at the hospital at the time the moms enrolled in the study, with the first month gift already loaded onto the card. The gifts are then dispersed each month on the day of the child's birthday, and this disbursement is accompanied by a text message reminder to let the mom know that her card has been replenished. Now, you may have noticed I've been using the term cash gift. That's intentional. The money is funded by charitable sources, not the government, and it meets the legal definition of a gift in that we're not asking for anything in return, including research participation. And so because it is a legal gift, it means it's not taxable. And we worked very hard before the start of the study to ensure that to the extent possible, this money wouldn't count in determining mothers' eligibility for other government services and benefits. Now, before we recruited our first mother, we laid out several predictions of what we expected to see. Specifically, in terms of how we thought the cash was likely to impact families, we laid out predictions in terms of two pathways. Now, the first pathway we call the increased investment pathway, and this is really about what money can buy. So we predicted that moms in the high cash gift group would be more likely to be able to afford things like books and toys, perhaps higher quality childcare, better housing and safer neighborhoods. And the other pathway we call the reduced stress pathway. So this is the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to make that monthly rent check or keep the lights on, they're more likely to report lower stress, perhaps better mental health, and be more likely to engage in the kind of warm parenting that we know is so important for supporting children's development. Now, one of the beautiful things about money is that it can be used differently in different homes. So chances are these pathways operate differently in different families, and that's okay. We're carefully measuring these pathways along the way, but ultimately our primary outcomes of interest center on the children. So with all of that said, what are we seeing so far? So first, let me tell you a little bit about that household investment pathway, what money can buy. So we're seeing some early support for our initial hypotheses. Specifically, moms in the high cash gift group are spending more on child-focused expenditures, things like books and toys. We're also seeing that moms in the high cash gift group are reporting that their children are consuming fresh produce at greater rates. Now, what are we not seeing? We're not seeing any statistically detectable effect of cutting back on employment across the first 3 years of the cash gifts. And in both groups, we're seeing very low frequency of money spent on alcohol or tobacco and no significant differences between groups. So absolutely no evidence that the cash gifts are sparking increased use of or spending on substances. And you can see the details of all of those findings on papers that we've posted on our website. Now, what about the second pathway I mentioned, our expectation that we would see reductions in maternal stress and perhaps improvements in mental health? Well, counter to expectations, we're not yet seeing any significant improvements in self-reported mental health, and in fact, some evidence for greater perceived and parenting stress. And what about impacts on parenting? Well, much like I mentioned first about the increased child-focused expenditures, we're also seeing that moms are investing more time in their children. So moms in the high cash gift group are reporting significantly higher amounts of time spent engaged in parent-child activities, things like reading and playing in the first 3 years. And finally, what about impacts directly on the children? So I'm going to tell you in a moment about impacts that we saw and reported after the first year of cash gifts on infant brain development. Now, you might ask, how do we measure infant brain activity? So I'm going to give you a quick primer. I promise it won't be too painful. We measure brain activity using this methodology called electroencephalography, or EEG, colloquially known as measuring brain waves. EEG is great for young kids. It's safe, it's fast, it's relatively simple to capture. And with this EEG cap, we can listen in to the brain's electrical signals. Now, of course, we're not mind readers. We don't know what a child's thinking, but we are able to measure the speed of the brain's electrical signals. And we care about the speed of that brain activity for a few reasons. So first of all, we know that as children get older, they tend to have more fast-paced brain activity. We also know from past work that kids who are at risk for learning and attention disorders often tend to exhibit less fast-paced brain activity compared to their peers. And likewise, most germane for today, past work has suggested that in many cases, children facing early poverty often exhibit less fast-paced brain activity compared to their more advantaged peers. And so we reasoned that perhaps the cash gifts would reverse this pattern. Specifically, we predicted that the infants of the moms in the high cash gift group would show more fast-paced brain activity and less slow-paced brain activity than the infants of the moms in the low cash gift group. And indeed, after just 12 months of monthly unconditional cash support, we've already seen emerging group differences in fast-paced brain activity, such that the infants in the high cash gift group are showing more fast-paced and more very fast-paced brain activity compared to the infants in the low cash gift group. And notably, this pattern is particularly strong in parts of the brain that support thinking and learning. Now, this early finding has already received a lot of attention. It's been cited more than 100 times in the scientific literature, and it received worldwide attention in the popular press, including this front page story on the New York Times. But our work isn't done. We're very much looking forward to continuing to measure impacts as kids get older to see whether these impacts persist or grow. We're also engaged in a qualitative sub-study in which a subsample of the mothers are participating in repeated in-depth interviews, so we really have a better understanding of mothers' perception of the baby's first year's money. And the moms describe using the money mostly to cover existing expenses. They tell us that taking on substantial new expenses has been rare, and it's very common for them to buy necessities as well as sometimes some special extras for their kids. They really highlight to us the importance of joy. So one mom, Nina, that's a pseudonym, from New Orleans, tells us it's the small things that excite them. And they're even like, you know, Mama, can we get popcorn so we can have movie night? Now, what's happening now? Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we did have to collect data remotely for part of the first birthday visit, as well as children turned 2 and 3. But I'm happy to say we're back in person as children are turning 4, and we're collecting a whole host of information on children's cognitive, behavioral, and brain developments, their health, mothers' parenting styles, as well as many other measures. We expect to wrap up this wave of data collection later this summer, and then report the impacts of this monthly unconditional cash support on direct assessments of child development and health within the next year. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Lisa Janetian, to talk a bit about some of the implications.
Thank you, Kim. So I wanted to just step back for a minute and summarize what we're learning so far in babies' first years, and then contextualize what it means for the research evidence that is building with our study and other studies, and then setting up sort of the how babies' first years might fit into policy conversations that we're going to turn to next during this webinar. So as Kim just described, so far we are seeing higher net income amongst the families that are receiving the high cash gift relative to the families that are receiving the monthly low cash gift. And this is important because it means that our intent to reduce poverty amongst these families is actually translating into impact. And in part, we're seeing higher net income because we're not seeing large or dramatic reductions in the primary sources of income among these families, which is earnings. So we are not seeing large negative impacts on employment and related measures of labor supply. In particular, we're not seeing mothers and other adults so far dropping out of the labor force. On spending, more money is being spent on child-specific goods. In the early years, this is really important. It includes things like diapers that are not covered traditionally by other types of safety net programs. And in the later years, we see it shifting to toys and books and other things. Moms are reporting more time being spent with children on early learning activities, playing, reading, and building. And notably, this does not seem to be a trade-off in time with time being spent in the paid labor force. It's important to remember we're not seeing improvements in maternal subjective or psychological well-being. In the early years of the study, we saw some indication of increased anxiety. We don't see that as the study follow-up continues. And we're not seeing higher rates of anxiety in this sample over the course of the pandemic, nor do we see rates of anxiety that look high or higher than what you might expect in a representative generalized population of moms. The findings are really grounded in mothers' voices. They express that the money enables joy and pride. And we feel really fortunate to be able to elicit those expressions of what the money means and infuse it in this study. And as Kim just described, our earliest look at development shows that infants in the high cash gift group show more fast-paced brain activity that is associated with thinking and learning. Next slide. So just to step back for a second and reflect on this enormous research endeavor that we've embarked on in the last decade, what can this body of evidence bring to the table in terms of research? What we've designed is a reliable, regular, monthly cash support in the US context that is available to families at the time of birth. What we can learn from this is that there is a way to distribute cash that's effective with high uptake and use. We are learning from the transactions on that debit card that you just learned that almost every family, in fact, every family except for one, we see high use of the card. So the money gets downloaded efficiently and it goes out into the economy in various ways. This research is about supporting mothers as parents and children's healthy early development. And the design of this cash is unconditional, offers a lens into what it means to have autonomy and flexibility in having more financial resources in ways that can meet family needs and goals. That might be very individual and might be very heterogeneous, depending on a family's circumstances. Our study very much focused on children's development. That'll be a recurring theme of the study. We expend a lot of time and resources in collecting children's development well. We also want to make sure to acknowledge that this study, and in fact, cash support more widely, cannot eliminate or address all the structural vulnerabilities, including legacies of racism in our country that are highly correlated with poverty. Next slide. In terms of policy, this study gives us a framework and some evidence that we hope will be useful to many folks on the impact of predictable income support starting at birth of child. And this can go in either direction. What happens when resources increase? What might happen if resources decrease? I just wanted to offer a few thoughts from our team as it's relevant to the 2021 expanded child tax credit and the conversation that will be coming up on the child tax credit. Just to remember a few features of this research design, which is not a scaled policy, but can inform scaled policies. One is a distinction on amount and eligibility criteria. And so the amount of the cash gift tested here is very close to the amount proposed under the expanded child tax credit, which was $37.60 annually for young children, and paid monthly. So it mimics some of those features. It is a stable cash payment, however, regardless of changing circumstances or existing circumstances. So the monthly cash support in this study will not change according to the number of children or the ages of children or shifting family structures or get adjusted because of inflation. The other feature that's notable and a little bit different than how we might think about scaled policy right now is implementation and design. So receipt of this cash gift is automatic, it is child-centric, it is on a debit card, and is provided from private charities and not the government. And it was important for us to answer the research questions of the study that the cash in this study did not count against other benefits in a mechanical or automatic way. Of course, families can make choices about other benefits, so it is exempt from many of the other safety net benefits. Last slide. The study would not be possible with an enormous team. Many of us are on this call, many of us are not. And we're really grateful for the support from philanthropy as well as the National Institute of Health. And we thank you for your attention and inviting us to this conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to all the researchers for the presentation and for sharing your findings with us. I just briefly want to direct a question or two to the researchers before we sort of go to our other experts and expand to our full panel later in the event. I think you all touched on this some in your presentation, but I would love, from a researcher's perspective, from the point of view of these findings, I will just say, obviously I've read the work and hearing you all describe it. There is a lot of interest. I think one of the reasons, going back to our earlier theme of bipartisanship, being able to bring different stakeholders together from both sides of the aisle, there's a lot of interest, particularly in finding ways to help kids and families during those first years, right? Per the name of your all study, right? That's an area where I think where there's a lot of commonality, there's a lot of interest in doing something, whether that's from the angle of child tax credit or from the angle of trying to do something creative in the paid family leave space, or how can we find creative solutions to give parents the economic flexibility to be able to spend more time with their kids, early on. So with that, I just would love to go around to each of you, to the extent that you're comfortable, or whoever wants to answer this, just to touch upon what you feel personally are sort of maybe a most important or an interesting takeaway for policymakers that you particularly want them to be hearing from your research. Maybe I'll start with Kimberly, and then y'all can just go around.
Sure. I think by shining a spotlight on the children, right, we're really showing the importance of reducing poverty for our youngest citizens, who are the future of society, right? So it, in some ways, downplays conversations about adult choices and really talks about supporting families, and particularly children.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Lisa?
Sure, I will quickly chime in. I think the point that you made about starting at birth, the language of welcoming a child is, I think, an important way to think about this. And we might think about things like resources as a public health investment in children during those important early years. Our findings really point to tough trade-offs that families are making under really income constrained circumstances. I think it points to the strength and resilience of families, right? And that they're going to be devoting resources in ways, they want what everyone else wants and what policy wants, which is to do the best for their children.
Absolutely. I don't know if someone else wanted, Catherine,
Yeah,
do you jump in?
I'll just jump in quickly. And I think, one of the things that we have seen, particularly as we're talking to parents, is that there are programs that help in a lot of different ways that exist. So it's not an either or, it's an and. And one of the things that CASH does is it can enable parents to take care of all the things, right? For those of you that are parents out there, there's all the things when you have very young children, and all the trade-offs, as Lisa discussed. But having CASH enables them to do many of the things that they want and need to do for their children in ways that other safety nets just don't fill the gaps, whether it's because diapers are expensive or car seats are expensive. It's important to use the CASH in ways that really can benefit the children.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to ask one more question that's just drilling in a little bit more specifically for the researchers, and then we'll introduce our other panelists in a moment. Obviously, I think the role that I want to play in this panel, in part going forward here for you all and for the other experts, is one of, I'm going to play the role of the skeptic, because I think that us doing our work on the Hill, there's a lot of desire to work in this space Republicans, moderates in the middle, Democrats, a lot of people have an interest in this overall area. There's possibility for legislating toward the end of this year. There's the opportunity to try to get some things done in this space during the 2025 tax policy, tax package, when a lot of the current or tax provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire. So we have a couple of opportunities upcoming. One of the big sticking points in that conversation, right, is, as everyone here I'm sure knows, is going to be the idea of the impacts of this type of policy on work, right? And you all talked about this already, and the lack of a statistically significant effect on employment or work participation that you all found in this study. I was just hoping you all could talk a little bit more about that, about the findings on employment, and about, I think, sort of what those who are concerned about that aspect of this type of policy should take away from what it is you've looked, what they should take away, and then maybe what it also doesn't address, right? But what part of that concern does it address in your all's minds? I can go to anyone who'd like to.
Yeah. So I participated in the analysis of the employment data. I think it's important to point out that there are some important differences between how our cash payments work with respect to work incentives and how extending the child tax credit works with respect to work incentives. We have this pure income transfer, and the child tax credit is more complicated for reasons we don't want to get into. But elements of disincentivizing work are somewhat stronger in the child tax credit extension than in ours. So our findings aren't as directly relevant. It's not the same policy that we're trying out. So that's the caveat. I would also just make the point that we need to think about these kind of safety net programs, not only in terms of their possible costs, the behavioral costs, but in terms of their potential benefits, right? After all, these are developed mostly for the goal of promoting child well-being. So we won't be able to resolve in a definitive way what the work impacts are. For so far they don't seem to be anything remarkable. But I think our most important role is more on the child development side. Once we find out from our age 4 data collection and lab visits what these impacts are for child well-being, I think that's our real role, the most important role we'll have in policy discussions.
Absolutely. Okay, so Greg, you set it up very well. I'm going to turn it over, or I'm going to introduce the rest of our panelists and bring in the broader discussion here. So I want to turn to our two respondents, both individuals who are noted researchers, economists, who are experts in this space in general, low-income and family policy here in the United States. So first, I want to introduce Elaine Mag, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and is a co-director for innovations in cash assistance for children. Elaine, her expertise in this will become evident very, very soon. I also want to introduce Aparna Mathur, who is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, is a former senior economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and also a former resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Both of these are voices I was very excited that we're going to be able to have as a part of this conversation. So first, I'm going to just direct a few questions to the two of you all from the sort of policy perspective, and then we'll bring the researchers back in and we'll talk with everyone. So Elaine, we'll start with you. The thing I was hoping you could do for us is sort of contextualize this research from babies' first years amongst the broader landscape of research in this general space that has come about in the last couple of years. There have been, as you well know and can speak to, there have been findings and research and studies that have come to different conclusions on some of these key questions. That has been the source of much debate over the last number of years. And so I was hoping that you could lend your thought on where this particular project sits in that broader landscape.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. I feel like I'm in this team of all-stars and it's such a pleasure. I want a little bit of the study. To me, it's quite exciting. So even though, Greg says we can't entirely answer this looming question of employment, I think the study makes important contributions. So as background, I think a lot of people know there's an existing debate. What happens when you put money in households, particularly very low-income households? Does it cause people to work less because they have an alternate source of income? And then there's some folks who say it allows people to work more. And so there's some predictive studies, most notably out of the University of Chicago, that suggests that families will work less. And they base this information on some older historical responses, particularly to programs like TANF that phase out as earnings increase. So parents saw they worked more and they weren't that much better off. And there's not a lot of incentive perhaps to put in additional hours. Other folks have also looked at these time periods and said that there's still a significant decrease in poverty, even if you assume some people will drop out of the labor force. We might think that secondary earners are less likely to work additional hours or might work a little less. And in the EITC literature, we also often say we're subsidizing a secondary earner to maybe stay home and take care of a child. The baby's first year results fit in quite well with two studies I worked on. One sponsored by Humanity Forward and led by Leah Hamilton and Stephen Roll, where they said that when people received the monthly child tax credit payments, they purchased additional childcare. That's consistent, I think, with the findings here. It also, we found evidence that people went out to learn new skills. So they were making an investment in themselves to get a better job later, perhaps. They also purchased some transportation. There's work at the Urban Institute that's quite similar to what Baby's First Year is suggesting, where we looked at families who had received the payments. And we looked in 2020 and at their employment levels. And then we looked at the end of the payments at employment levels, and we didn't see any significant differences. So our story was that everyone was working a little bit more after that pandemic slack in the market. People returned to work. And I think that's quite similar to what this random control trial is showing, that there's no significant differences in the high benefit mothers and the lower benefit mothers. And so I think this is one more piece of information that suggests, overall, a relatively small payment in someone's annual income is not enough to cause significant employment losses. I also really like how the research team frames this in, there's two pieces here, and the other piece is the child, and we shouldn't forget all the benefits that the child is receiving.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elaine. I want to direct my next question to Aparna to get in on the conversation here. I think that, a lot of where the sort of the place of coming together is for this space. How can we find a way to support kids and families in a way that either doesn't disincentivize or ideally incentivizes or encourages participation in the workforce that is relatively low cost, right, to be able to include in one of these big tax packages, and that helps families deal with inflation and doesn't cause more inflation, right? Like that's the sort of the meaty middle where I think a lot of this stuff can come together. You have spent a lot of time at the intersection of research and policies that affect low-income families writ large, not just this. So I'm curious, what's most striking to you from the Baby's First Year's findings, and how do you see the findings from this and just this type of, policy intervention in general playing into things in a bipartisan way over the next year or two?
Thank you so much, Liam, and thank you to Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity and all the funders and donors for putting this together. I'm so excited to be here. I love this work. I think we've learned a lot from this particular RCT. I look at the debate on the child tax credit, and I look at the research that's coming out of this team. And I would put a little bit more weight on the randomized control trial, because I think it's actually telling us, well, what happens when people are actually given a cash transfer. The CTC setting is different. I think Greg was talking about that, right? It's still a tax credit. Most people at the back of their minds are still thinking, okay, I need to have I need to be filing a tax return, and that's how I become eligible for it. During the pandemic, yes, it turned out that, it turned into basically a cash transfer. And so let's try to get some lessons from that. But I think this RCT actually gets more directly at the question of what happens when people are actually given cash. So some of the things that struck me were, how important is the role of cash in people's lives, right? And I do a lot of research at the Kennedy School looking at the social safety net. And one thing that's striking is how much we've moved away from simply being, giving people cash to meet their needs. We have we still have cash welfare through TANF. But even in the research that the team put out, it was striking that only about 13% of families actually take up TANF, right? And so clearly there are some administrative challenges or others that are stopping people from actually getting cash. Second, the cash that came out was given to families actually came out in a predictable way and with few strings attached, or actually no strings attached. And I think, again, when I look at the US social safety net, that's not typically the case, right? There's a lot of hoops that people have to go through. We are seeing a lot of research that says that even, setting up an interview with a caseworker may sometimes allow, discourage people from getting access to SNAP and other benefits. So I really think it speaks to the idea that we could be doing much more if you're really serious about helping families in need. How do we redesign the US, social safety net so that we give a little bit more cash to people, it comes in a little bit more predictable and, fewer strings attached way. The third piece is our current safety net is heavily work focused. And sometimes I look at the findings that we see for employment, even from this RCT, and I wonder how much of that is, that we gave people $300 in cash and we're trying to read too much into the employment effects. But actually, the rest of the safety net is still very work focused. And, a lot of people in the study said, well, how will this interact with the government benefits that we are already getting? We don't want to lose them, and it really spoke to me because that's what we hear all the time. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that people are just not able to access the help that they need. And they're really worried that, $300 additional are just going to push them off the safety net. So we need to be really thinking seriously about that. I love the fact that having access to cash actually made people, made mothers much more likely to spend time with their kids. I think that speaks to a lot of earlier research where we looked at high income versus low income households. And we find that, where families have the time and the resources, children just have better earlier years, and that leads to better outcomes in the longer run. And finally, I think what was interesting to me is that $300 is not enough to alleviate, all the financial stresses that families are going through. And so you still continue to see families worrying about bill payments and, how can we make ends meet? And yes, is the money actually going to keep coming? And so I think, what speaks to me most about the study is that it highlights that, yes, this is a small amount of money. It's not going to be enough to, it doesn't seem to have people sort of dropping off payrolls and, sitting at home and saying, well, this is great. I don't need to be doing anything else. But it also tells me, how the safety net could work and how can we come together in a bipartisan way to maybe, one idea I've had, and I can talk about this later as well, Liam, is to actually look at a cash component in the safety net. We could pair a temporary cash component to the current safety net while also keeping the existing programs. And I would, love to talk about that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing, Aparna. I was going to ask to both of you before we bring the researchers back in, I was going to ask you all another question specifically on the work, but we've actually already talked about that a bunch, and I'm sure it'll come up again. So I wanted to actually ask the both of you, Elaine and Aparna, sort of for your take on alternate frames for this conversation. What I mean by that is that over the last couple of years in particular, this conversation has been dominated in the policy sphere by child poverty, child well-being, which is certainly very important. But I think that we've already gotten a sort of a taste of this from the researcher's presentation. There are a lot of alternate frames of looking at this, whether it's the sort of paid leave frame, helping parents spend time with kids during early years. Maybe it's the sort of, educational competitiveness frame. How do we want America to be able to compete and how much more successful are our students and young people going to be if they're having that increased brain activity that we saw in the, during those first years, and they're going to be more successful in school and career and so on. And that's going to put America in the strongest position possible to compete in the 21st century, whatever those might be. So I just think I'd be very curious to hear from each of you sort of what, either from the baby's first years research or more generally, you would like to see more conversation about, and in this general discussion, aside from just the sort of, again, just the sort of traditional child poverty frame. Whoever of you would like to start, jump in.
I can go first. Whenever I think about this work, and it's not just about the child tax credit or childcare or paid family leave. For me, it's always been about improving economic opportunity. That was how my interest in these topics came about, because I was doing all of this research on what can we do to help households sort of move up in life, right? It's not about let's give people more cash, but like, what is the longer run goal? And the longer run goal is that families can see economic mobility. I think the senator talked about how we are struggling on that front in the US. So, looking at things like education, childcare, paid family and medical leave, all of that neatly fits into this. And I think, again, coming back to this research, what was striking to me was that we actually don't see the negative employment effects. So again, yes, this is an RCT. So we do need to be careful that, as with all RCTs, right, it's very specific to the amounts of money we're talking about. Will this generalize to a larger population? Will this look different if we applied it geographically to different parts of the US? But to me, looking at paid family leave, again, and looking at childcare and trying to end child poverty, it always comes down to, these kinds of policies not only help families spend more time with their children, spend more time, sort of investing in themselves and their families, but it's also a way for them to be connected to the workforce. Paid family and medical leave would allow families to take that time off when they need it, but at the same time have a job to go back to. And a lot of the research supports that, right? And so I've always, looked at these policies not as a form of pure welfare, but really as a form of improving economic attachment to the workforce, while at the same time caring for families and caring for children.
So before I became a mother, the downsides of becoming a parent were very, very clear. I would not be able to just leave my house when I wanted. I, was responsible for this other person, and would really radically change my life. But the upsides were not as clear because they were, much vaguer. As soon as I had children, it became clear that this was, one of my greatest labors has been being a mother. And I would like to change the conversation so that legislators similarly, rather than thinking about the immediate costs of delivering some sort of social policy, thinking of the investment we're making and thinking about all the positive benefits. There's research that suggests that when we allow children to grow up in poverty, we are placing a tremendous burden on these children and society later in life. We mostly lose a lot of productivity. Children are not getting as much education as they otherwise would. They're not completing college. They're not engaged in the type of labor market activities later as adults that we might want them to. They're also more likely to engage in criminal behavior or rely on the safety net. And so I would love to see this conversation reframed as really requiring folks to think about the benefits of investing in children and not just thinking about that immediate cost. It's sort of, we're restricted to this 10-year budget window in a lot of policy conversations, but that's not how motherhood works, and that's not how investing in children work. And so I would love to see the conversation reframed in that way.
Fantastic answers, really interesting. Thank you both. Stay on. We're gonna bring our BFY researchers back on. So if those of you who are not on video want to turn it back on, there we are. Okay, welcome back. Now, as I understand it, I have been told, I thought I was gonna have to rush through my questions here so we could stay on track. But as I understand it, the researchers, while they haven't been resting, they've been answering audience questions in the Zoom. So thank you all for doing that. If there are questions that, again, members of the audience, if you have more questions that come up and they get passed to me, I'm more than happy to answer them here, or they'll get answered directly in the chat. In the meantime, I'll continue with the questions I wanted to ask. This is something for everyone. Not everyone needs to answer, but we can tick through if people would like to contribute. Common concern about these types of benefits or policies is that the concern about money being spent on cigarettes or alcohol or other substances, things like that. So I know you all touched on this in your findings in the presentation. And I think the study had interesting findings on this topic. I was going to start with either Catherine or Lisa. I'm curious if what you all found in the spending habits or the spending decisions from the families who received the bigger payments, the larger payment sizes, particularly with regards to this concern.
So I'll kick off and then I will hand it over to Catherine and the other PIs. So first, let me start. This is a research study. We could not do a full budget appraisal, but we really focused on questions to the families on the highest expenditure categories, right, that we know take up most of the budget for families who are residing close to the poverty line. And we got pretty close, right? So we asked about things like food and cable and utility and rent. And then we ask a whole battery of questions very focused on the child, as you heard before. And in fact, we are capturing about over 85% of expenditures relative to income. So that tells you two things. One, that these are the basic kinds of expenditures that families spend money on, and that's generalizable. Actually, we see that with national samples. But two, that we can also speak to across these really important needs categories and child-focused categories. We see a lot of the increased income going towards the child-specific categories. So we mentioned before, that's diapers that are not covered by many existing safety net programs. That includes things like books and toys and clothing that are, again, not always consistently covered by existing safety net programs, but also things that might bring children lots of joy and bring the family a lot of comfort in giving children the things that everyone would like to give their children. So on the alcohol and cigarettes, we do ask about that in the survey. This was already mentioned in our slide presentation. We have two forms of data. So one is seeing how the actual high cash gift transactions are working. And we see very few transactions in the types of stores that you might associate with spending money on alcohol and cigarettes. So we don't see lots of transactions in tobacco or kind of other venues in which you would likely be buying those kinds of goods. And then we also ask families about money they're spending on these goods. And there is a very low number of families that report spending money on these goods. And we don't see significant differences. So relatively speaking, small proportion of the budget, if it exists, and we're seeing a lot of the budget going towards serve these basic needs and children's goods. So Catherine, do you want to add to that? No.
Cool. I'm going to jump ahead. We've got some audience questions coming in now. So here's an interesting question from the audience, which I will direct to whichever member of the Babies First Years team wants to pick this up. The question is, has the Babies First Years team found that because of the fact that the program targets and focuses on low-income mothers specifically, have they found that they have experienced any stigma associated with using the cards that they've been given? Whoever wants to pick that up would love to hear from them.
I'll take that one. Not that we're aware of, no. So we were very thoughtful. I know there was one of our slides had a picture of the card. So we tried to make it look both like it was specific to BFY, so it says for my baby, but also try and make sure that it didn't match a food assistance card in that state in terms of colors, that it doesn't look stigmatizing. It looks like a card that many people would use to purchase things. And we have heard from the mothers that they're able to use it. They don't have any problems using it. and that they feel that the way in which the program is set up, which is it's regular, it's reliable, and it's unconditional, is very supportive of their goals and is not stigmatizing as sometimes other programs, which are more conditioned on expectations for how the money can be spent, can make people feel. So, the other thing I'll quickly note is that it's not a large number of people participating in the program. So at most, 298 in any one city. So it's not that many other people outside of the program would know about it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so I want to go around. We're going to do two of these, go around to each of the panelists, so the researchers and our policy experts. I would love for each of you to just share very briefly what remaining questions you have in this space generally, right? So obviously, the findings we've already gotten from babies' first years are really interesting and illuminate a lot. I'd be very curious to hear, maybe in particular from the babies' first years folks, what more they're looking forward to seeing from this particular project, or in general, and from Elaine and Aparna, just in general, I think what remaining questions you think are kind of lingering in an unanswered fashion, or new domains, or new sort of, again, frames, new angles of looking at this that would be great to see more research on. So I'm gonna nominate Kimberly to go first and then just pass it around.
Happy to. So far we've got the earliest glimpse as to how cash supports may support children's development. You alluded, Liam, to the idea that, what we're really interested in is certainly impacts beyond age 1 and even beyond preschool age, right? So of course, we're excited for the next year findings that'll be coming out to see whether these impacts on brain development persist, to see whether they translate into cognition and behavior. But where the rubber really meets the road is going to be looking much longer term. What are the long-term impacts of early childhood infusion of cash supports on long-term development and health?
Lisa, you want to go next?
Thank you. it's gonna be a little bit of an echo chamber that really, what we're looking for in this study was our primary mission, which is what's going to happen in children's development. And that'll be, happening now in the next year. We're going to continue to follow these children as they transition to schooling, formal schooling, and beyond. And so understanding how these cumulative effects happen over time is really important. But I want to mention one other thing, which is what's also happening with families. And this has not come up, but many of these, we're focused on one child. There are multiple children in these households. And so I hope that over time, we will also think about and learn more about the well-being of all children, sort of a whole child perspective on what this predictable cash support might mean.
Wonderful. Catherine?
Yeah, I'll try and add something novel. I agree, of course, with what Lisa and Kim said. We're most interested in the long run impacts on the children and families. But I think one of the benefits of our study is that we do have a qualitative study alongside of this rigorous quantitative study. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing over time how the mothers continue to talk about it as their children are growing up. So we get to hear from their voices. And we currently have planned sort of a photo voice bit of work too. So more directly being able to see how mothers interpret how the money has helped them. I think it's a really important part of this work is to make sure that their voices and experiences continue to be centered throughout the project.
Wonderful. Greg?
My other work, some of my other work, I've focused on early childhood education programs and the extent to which impacts that they generate by the end of the program persist beyond the end of the program. We've taken the decision to continue payments for 6 full years, plus a few months. So you can think of our treatment as being a poverty reduction during the entire period of early childhood. And when we go out and do our age 6 data collection, we'll be able to see what the impacts are after 6 full years of income payments, poverty reduction. We're also interested in beyond that. To what extent do these impacts that show up at the end of the treatment persist beyond the end of the treatment? And if you look at the early childhood education literature, you see a lot of fade out. Are we likely to see fade out? it really bears on this question of to what extent is early childhood a particularly sensitive period for the benefits of poverty reduction. So that's what I'm especially interested in.
Wonderful. Thanks, Greg. Aparna?
Yeah, I'm curious. I know everybody's touched on a lot of things. I'm not going to get into that, but the question with all RCTs, like how scalable is this, right? Like what is the longer term policy implication? So your costs are already at 6 million for helping 1,000 families, but what do we do? Is there a policy recommendation here? Is the idea that we would then, cut out a little bit of the rest of the safety net because we do think that this kind of safety net works better? And I think I would love to see sort of how would this interact with the existing safety net. You've been very careful to say that you had to work with state and local governments, because in a lot of cases, mothers probably didn't want to get off the other programs because they thought, okay, this is a temporary policy at the end of the day. So how do we think about the interaction with the safety net and the cost piece? How scalable is this? And do you think the results would replicate? And what's the external validity of this current RCD?
Fantastic. And Elaine, rounding us out.
I'll say +1 to everything. That my two unique hopes are I'm interested in what Ju brought up at the beginning about did we see an interruption in that pathway onto the child welfare system? I know that's maybe very difficult to pick up. The second issue is I would love to hear in the qualitative component a little bit more about for mothers who are second-time mothers, how was this time around different? And if you're following them later in life, how is a subsequent birth different without the payments directed to the child?
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we've heard such great things. I've been in the event which I realized was a fantasy now, in the event that we had extra time, I've been jotting down questions that you all have spurred in my mind by your responses. I've been jotting them down, but we only have a few minutes left. So I am just going to ask each of you, we're going to go around one more time, just 30 seconds a piece, about any closing message you have, either an overall takeaway from this research that you want policymakers and everyone who's listening here to remember and to be thinking about. We'll sort of go around in the exact same order. Kimberly, why don't you start us off, closing remarks?
Or, I think one thing that was particularly striking was Senator Bennet saying that children have no lobbyists, right? And so I think it is so important for us to think about how our policies and supports benefit children who are the future of our society, right? They aren't making the choices about the circumstances that they're living in, and yet they are the future of what we have to look forward to. And so I can't think of anything that's more important than developing programs and policies that support children.
Wonderful. Lisa?
Thank you. So in my own research and then working with this team, I just am continually struck at how the US policy context is designed and kind of its expectations on kind of human behavior and parents' behavior. And I think one message that has come through in this conversation today is that parents work really hard, and that the way that they're working includes multiple things, right? So caregiving, protecting their children, earning money, launching their children to economic opportunity. And the way that our system is designed is kind of quite the opposite, right? Our system is really designed as if you can't do this on your own, you're deemed a failure. And so I do think this is a time when we can rethink that frame from a policy perspective in the ways that we've been talking about today, and just really harness what families already bring to the table.
Catherine, you're up.
Yeah, I'll underscore both of those points and just say that I think it's important that we really listen to what the mothers and families tell us about how cash support can really support their parenting goals and their goals for their children and their families and their futures. I mean, they tell us that it's incredibly helpful to be able to have $20 to get milk when they need it, to be able to fill up the tank with gas. And I just feel like it's incredibly important that we are willing to listen to them and understand how to build a safety net that better works for children and for families.
Greg?
So ever the cautious academic, I would say stay tuned. Our
Nice.
our big payoff data collections are taking place now and will take place at age 6. So that is when we'll really know to what extent poverty reduction affects kids and in what ways. So we're on pins and needles for our age 4 data collection. We're almost done with, but that's really the kind of payoff for the study.
Wonderful. Aparna.
So to me, this really speaks to not just reforming the safety net, but also simplifying the safety net, right? If we could do a little bit more with cash, and I'm not saying, this is about universal basic income, but I've toyed with the idea of thinking about a temporary cash transfer when families are going through a particular time of economic crisis or need, but then allowing, easier and simpler access to the traditional safety net that may come with a few, strings attached. Maybe there are work requirements, but I think there's an immediate period of need around the time of crisis where I think cash could be super helpful. So I think thinking about ways that we can simplify the system so that families are not struggling to access the help that is due to them, would be amazing.
Lovely. Elaine?
I would just note that this study is unique in that it presents an unconditional cash payment, and this allows us to not build on an employment system that already, replicates existing inequalities in the labor market. So when we tie benefits to work, we can pile on to an unfair system. And then I would, suggest to all policymakers that this issue of child poverty is so important that Washington cannot go home again without dealing with it.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, and thank you to all of you. We're going to conclude the event here. I just want to say thank you to all of you for tuning in and for participating in this event. I also want to say thank you to all of our panelists and our speakers. Thank you to Senator Bennet for joining us earlier. I want to thank the Doris Duke Foundation again for supporting this event, to the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity for helping organize all of this. Thank you to my colleagues at American Policy Ventures for helping support and get all this together. And most importantly, I want to say, thank you to the Babies First Years team and for this research. I think this is already a really significant contribution to the body of research in this space. And as Greg, as you said earlier, stay tuned, right? We will definitely stay tuned, and we're looking forward to the additional findings that you all will be sharing with us in the months and years ahead from this wonderful research. But I think it's already been a great contribution. And I'll just end by saying thank you to all the attendees for joining us. If you would like to rewatch some of this, or you have a friend or colleague who was not able to join, there will be a recording of this event available on the Spotlight website. You can see the Spotlight on Poverty link on your screen right now. But thank you to all of you for joining. There's many people on this call, everyone from folks who were working on the Hill, working at think tanks, academics, researchers, many different stakeholders in this policy conversation. I hope that the findings and the work that was shared here today can help serve as part of a bipartisan foundation for productive policymaking in the months and years ahead. And I know just by looking at the names in the Zoom call here, there are many of the folks here in this Zoom will be playing a significant role in that conversation. So thank you to all of you. And with that, hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.